Those were the days. Hey guys, Justin Lee Howard here with another edition of Those Are the Days Extended. And today we are going to go down the road with one of Salem's most beloved characters, if not the most beloved character in all of Salem's history. And that, of course, is none other than Alice Horton. And actually, I'm going to take you guys back to sort of a sadder time when we were sort of saying goodbye to Alice Horton. This, of course, was June 25th, 2010, when Salem in the audience, we sort of said our final goodbyes to Alice Horton. She had passed away. This is actually a few months after Frances Reed, iconic Frances Reed, who played Alice Horton for, I don't know, 40, almost 50 decades at this point. She had actually passed earlier in the year. And during that time, she still made her appearances on the show. Of course, we know when it sort of transitioned to a lot of her sitting in the Horton living room and sort of dispensing advice and having her there. And she was very prominent, sort of front and center. But yeah, she had passed earlier that year. And then this was the show, of course, paying tribute to her with her funeral. And of course, we had numerous people sort of come back to this sort of the similar experience we just had with Drake sort of passing and bringing people back to say goodbye to Alice. And it was a really big lead up. I think they spent at least a couple weeks sort of rallying the troops and having people share memories of her. And then this little collage here of all of some of her best moments throughout the years. Of course, married to Tom and her relationship with her kids and grandkids and just sort of the moral center of it. And out of this actually came something interesting. I don't know if you guys remember, but they sort of launched this interesting sort of umbrella storyline after Alice's death with Hope. I think it was Hope and Jennifer were sort of like going through her things. And this is when it was revealed that her and Stefano actually had this weird sort of like devil's bargain / alliance thing that they had going where Alice had actually helped Susan and Stefano when EJ was a toddler because he had gotten sick and needed sort of really sort of rare medical attention. And Alice, of course, being in the medical community for so many years through Tom and her connections, she basically used those connections to get EJ a doctor that saved his life. Stefano, of course, and Susan, of course, were grateful. And then this is when she sort of traded the information that, if you remember, John and Hope were actually married way back when. And it sort of was this kind of a secret. And she sort of kept it a secret because if it had come out, it would sort of invalidate their marriages to both Marlena and Bo at the time. So she sort of traded that information. It was sort of this interesting, kind of a shocker, like, oh, she had a connection to Stefano in a way who she really didn't have much to do with outside of, his tormenting of possible people in her family. But yeah, sort of opened this up to this kind of interesting umbrella storyline that went on for a few weeks, and it also helped fill in a little bit of the gaps in EJ's history in a weird way, because we know when EJ and Susan left the show, it was under the guise of they were in hiding. Marlena and John, everyone else helped them escape. Stefano was under the idea that Kristen had gotten away with EJ and that she was going to raise him overseas, and that was fine. That was sort of the best case scenario for Stefano that he was going to get regarding EJ and Susan, and he thought Kristen had sold Susan into slavery and that whole mess before Susan sort of switched the tables on Kristen there. But yeah, it sort of filled in the gaps that Stefano eventually did find Susan and EJ. He sort of inserted himself in their lives, and that's how he sort of gain control over EJ, because I know when they sourced him and brought sort of adult EJ on the show, people were sort of confused how he was molded after Stefano, if Susan had sort of escaped him and wasn't hiding, kind of a thing. So in a weird way, this sort of Alice death storyline helped bridge a lot of those gaps and answers to EJ's history when he was younger. So yeah, again, they had this interesting trade-off that came of someone's death. Yeah, and they used these sort of Alice Horton as the vehicle to do it, which I thought was sort of interesting, that even at her death, she was sort of protecting her family in her own way, and it wasn't afraid to also help out when she needed, even if it was Stefano, because she liked Susan, and EJ was at that point sort of an innocent child in the mix. So yeah, that was sort of interesting. But I'm gonna take you back to sort of where it all began, primarily with Alice on the show, especially during those early years of the show. And here is the sort of definitive Horton picture that I like to use, because it's one of the rare photos you see of Tom and Alice and all of the children. And I think in the beginning, they sort of very firmly center Tom and Alice as the moral center and moral sort of high ground of the show. And interesting, they sort of made the choice to make their children good people, some of them good people, but mostly dysfunctional, and sort of had Tom and Alice as, again, sort of the, not goody two shoes, but sort of the good parents whose sort of children got into like the weirdness and the mess of the soap opera, especially when Days premiered in the early 60s. And of course, here we have, if you're looking at the picture, of course, at the bottom row, we have, of course, Tom and Alice here. Then to the right of them, we have Addie, who we know was her own sort of, I don't want to say problem child, but she was sort of a bit of the wild child of the group. We've talked about it before, especially in when I did an episode on Julie and her history. She had a very complicated history with Addie, her mother. Of course, none of that was helped when she sort of went after Julie's ex-fiance, Doug, and then proceeded to have a baby with him. And that, of course, ended up being Hope. And so there's always, Addie was always sort of I say the rebellious one of the kids, very much so. And even to this day, I think sometimes when there's some reverence, I think, from Hope when she thinks of her mother, just because she was her mother and she died so young. But if you notice, there isn't a lot of there doesn't seem to be a lot of loving memories between her and Julie. Of course, they were at odds a lot of their life. They had a lot of the mother-daughter trials and tribulations kind of a thing. You'll see Julie a lot of times references Tom and Alice in sort of that parent role. She recognizes them as her grandparents, but the reverence she would speak of her parents, she usually relegates to them specifically and doesn't speak a lot of Addie so much. And I think part of that is just because of the trials and tribulations and but also a little bit of respect, I think, for Hope, when not to sort of, it was their mother, but Julie's the one who sort of had of course, the dominant relationship with her, which was not good a lot of the time. And so I think out of respect, she sort of keeps things relatively positive in regard to their mother, Addie. Then, of course, we go to the second row here on the top left, we have Bill Horton, who was just not problem child, doesn't even describe it. He was pretty much a bit of a terror back then. The sexual assaults on Laura, the stuff with Mike's paternity was an issue, especially with his brother Mickey, which, they were very much Cain and Abel back in the day. He sort of very, very famously took advantage of Kate back then, which of course, not resulted in Lucas, but he sort of took advantage of her at a difficult time and sort of not conned her, but he sort of preyed on her weakness a little bit. That's how we got Lucas, of course. Then he actually is the one who sort of helped bring Doug to town. He was in a cell shared a cell with Doug back in the day when he was in jail. So, Bill was a very, very complicated character who we didn't get to see much once he sort of left the canvas after his marriage to Laura broke up until his untimely death a few years ago. But yeah, we didn't see Bill a lot. Especially in those later years. Then, of course, next to him is very much Mickey Horton, who we remember fondly. It was very much the kind of like, I'd say, the golden child of the group. He very much was the one who stuck around Salem. He had his own trials and tribulations and stuff with Maggie, the amnesia, which led him to Maggie in the first place. He's the one who has the history of mental illness on the side of the Horton family, which in turn is what brought Marlena to the show, because she was brought in as his doctor and brought in to sort of consult on his case. But all in all, Mickey was very much the golden child of the Horton family, and that continued, of course, until his death, very much so. And also had a very close relationship, of course, with Alice. In the middle here, wearing the habit, of course, is Marie Horton. And then next to her is Tommy Horton. I say these two together because they are very much linked together considering their history. They, of course, are brother and sister, but we know what happened here. If you know the history, that Tommy Horton went off to the Korean War. he was injured in war and disfigured. He had plastic surgery and actually had amnesia. He came back to town as a different person, or looked like a different person, without Tommy Horton's memories. And Marie and he started dating. They sort of fell in love, and then the sort of bombshell was dropped that he was in fact her brother. That, of course, is what ultimately sent her to the convent, because of the sort of shame and sin of her being with her brother, even though, of course, they didn't know. It was a very interesting and controversial storyline for days, even back then. This, of course, would have been the late 60s, I think early 70s at this point. Very, very controversial. It sort of ushered sort of Marie onto a certain path for a little while. Good thing is we have seen Marie recently. When Doug unfortunately passed, she sort of came back to honor him. So we saw a little bit of Marie there, and she, of course, is the last surviving Horton child of this whole family. So yeah, hopefully we'll see her again in the future. But yeah, this is very much. I sort of love this photo whenever I see it come up when I'm looking sort of in our days sort of archival photos, just because it's one of the rare ones where all the siblings are together, with Tom and Alice here. But yeah, that was very much Alice Horton's foray into the show. The first at least 15 years was sort of reacting and responding to the trials and tribulations of kind of her dysfunctional kids at that point. And very much, again, always her and Tom, again, the moral center of the show, and always trying to steer their kids under the right path and sort of responding to their antics at that point. Yeah, I kind of want to jump a little ahead and want to sort of highlight, I think, one of my favorite storylines with Alice Horton here. And some of you may guess, this was, of course, the Salem Stalker storyline. And I covered this primarily in the Those Are Days Extended. I did on the whole Mela Swan storyline and how they came to be, and the outside effect on it. But I wanted to highlight it here because I think this was a real turning point for this storyline. I think, if you remember, they had just revealed that Marlena was a Salem Stalker and that sort of Alice was going to be her next victim. And I think people not knowing where the storyline was going, I think people thought this is going to be the definitive end of it, that Marlena as the Salem Stalker is going to get caught trying to kill Alice. This would be where, she gets caught, and this is sort of going to be the end of that storyline, at least here. And it wasn't. It was sort of the shock of daytime that Marlena, the heroine of the show, kills Alice Horton, sort of the most beloved character on the show. And it really made people sort of revolt a little bit when this happened, because at the time, of course, people didn't know that they were bringing these characters back. And so people thought, oh my God, they literally just killed off not only just the veterans on the show, but they had killed off the oldest living cast member on the show in this sort of weird way. And, they thought, oh my God, not only are we saying goodbye to Alice Horton, but, is it disrespectful to sort of have her succumb to this sort of weird storyline that they're trying to do? Remember, there was a lot of talk at the time and a lot of backlash that Days got over this idea that they were killing off all the vets. This is, if you remember, the initial first run of the victims were all sort of vets on the show. It was Maggie, it was Abe, it was Jack, it was Tony, it was Alice Horton at this point. So yeah, there was a lot of controversy surrounding not only that storyline, but also when it got to this point in sort of the killing of Alice Horton. We, of course, know that they eventually brought everyone back. But ironically, I think I may have mentioned this in the other video, that it was two people who sort of basically like spilled the tea on what was happening. Because when the public found out they were bringing all these people back, it was under the guise of, this was the plan all along. And then Frances Reed, and all of her glory and all of her sort of mature stature, sort of, again, spilled the tea and told, I can't remember, I don't know if it was Soap Opera Digest or what other publication, but she basically let it out that no, she was in fact fired at that, and that they were going to kill off Alice Horton as well as all the other vets on the show. And that sort of maybe the media reaction was what sort of brought them back. Again, there's still a little bit there's still a little bit of lore there if that was always the plan. But what she did reveal was that the actors did not know that. If it was the plan that they were going to be brought back 6 months to a year later, that was never told to them. They were actually fired from the show, and that was that. And sort of she, sort of threw sort of grease on the fire there when she did an interview and very much let it all hang out that she was in fact fired from the show, and that of course they brought her back, and she of course came back, and all's well that ended well there. But yeah, I always remember this as sort of a pivotal moment, not only for her character but also for this storyline, where you just knew it was going to go one way because of who they were involving, the character of Alice Horton, and then they totally subverted it and actually did kill her, which again was a big huge shock at the time. Yeah. So next up, I want to sort of dive into sort of a little bit of the later years of Alice Horton and what her sort of role was on the show. And I want to bring up this sort of photo of the Horton family because I think it exemplifies very much so who were the closest people. We have Alice, of course, here. We have Mickey and Maggie here, who we know were extremely close to Alice, especially during those later decades of her life. And then, of course, on the left side here, we have her 3 grandchildren who she was extremely close to. Like I said, this photo, I think, exemplifies who the people in her life at that point she very much was close to and very much interacted with on the show. And of course, I'm going to start with her relationship with Jennifer here, where if you're watching back then, Jennifer came onto the show as a teenager. She was sent by Bill and Laura to live with her grandparents, Tom and Alice, and sort of go to high school and finish out her teenage years there. And I think she was sort of the child that got to be raised by them a bit. I think at the time it was a really calculated way to sort of show how Tom and Alice would deal with a teenager and how they would raise a child. Because at this point when they started, all of the Horton children were already grown. And if you remember that first episode, or if you've seen clips, it started with sort of a teenage rebellious Julie. So of course, at that point, they were already grandchildren. Their children were grown and out of the house, still in and around Salem. But bringing sort of Jennifer into the mix, having her come back as a teenager, not only sort of ignited the teen scene at the time with her and Eve and Emilio and Frankie, but it also sort of showed Alice Horton, her sort of mothering skills, and her and Tom sort of taking on this challenge of dealing with this I won't say rebellious teenager. Jennifer was not too rebellious, but she did come with her own problems. She had her issues with her parents. She was getting into trouble, a little bit of trouble as a teen. And she also, which they very much sort of dealt with, was the issue of was Laura's mental illness sort of going to be passed down to her. So that was a big sort of theme that ran through Tom and Alice sort of parenting Jennifer in those early years. And then, of course, we have Alice and her relationship with Hope, which we all got to see. They were incredibly close. And I think it was highlighted, especially during the Hope-Gina years. We saw Alice as very much central in that storyline when Hope didn't know who she was. Again, she had a different personality. She was a different person named Gina. She came back to the show. Everyone was trying to figure out if she was Hope, is she not Hope, whatever. I think Alice Horton was very strident that she was Hope and took her in. And she sort of became, at that point, again, her name was Gina. She sort of became the character Gina Horton. And, sort of very much, if she wasn't Hope, she now was going to be another grandchild of Alice. She just very much took her in and was very strident that she had a connection with this woman and that she was her granddaughter Hope. And, Alice was very much front and center during that storyline. And then, of course, we saw it continue when Hope eventually did get her memories back and figure out who she was. That relationship continued. And then last but not least here in this photo, I think just one of my favorites was the relationship between Alice and Lucas. And if you remember at the time, Lucas sort of found out he was a Horton. It sort of rocked his world. Up until that point, he was very much enmeshed in the teen scene at the time with Sammy as his scheming best friend. He wanted Carrie. He had Austin was a thorn in his side before he found out they were brothers. So I think what this relationship did, not only was it it was a very slow build too. There's a few scenes, if you guys remember watching back then, where Lucas, after he found out, he didn't sort of know how to act around Alice. And this was right after he actually found out. I want to say maybe 2 or 6 months after Tom had passed, and so it was a very difficult time in the Horton family. Lucas coming in was looked at as this really like great miracle because they had just lost Tom. And Lucas again was there was a lot of trepidation with them coming if the Hortons would accept him. They were known as, this prominent family in Salem. He was coming in as the son of Kate, had just sort of found out his own history and his conception and what happened with his mom and dad. And so I remember those first scenes with her where he was nervous. And he kept calling her Mrs. Horton. He didn't know what to call her. And then they sat down and talked and they came up with I think he sort of adopted calling her Graham because Jennifer and Hope had called her that, or were calling her that. But yeah, I think it also did a great thing for the character of Lucas, not only bringing him in as a Horton, but it helped soften the character a little bit or show a different side of him. Because again, at that point, if you remember, he was sort of a little bit of a teen delinquent. He sort of had this chip on his shoulder, sort of walked around with a bit of an attitude. And sort of, I think it sort of being accepted by the Hortons and then his sort of bonding and relationship with Alice had really helped, like I said, sort of ease the character in, sort of branch him out a little bit more. So yeah, I've always loved this photo. I think it just exemplifies, like I said, the later years of the Horton family and who was sort of closest to Alice at that point. Another person who was incredibly, very, very close to Alice for very good reason, which I had to take a moment to highlight, was her relationship with Beau here. He affectionately called her Mrs. H. We of course know the Beau and Hope saga. She very much was always a fan of those two getting together. She very much was a supporter of theirs. Again, when Hope came back as Gina, she was very strident in that and wanting them two to get back together. But these two also had they also had some adventure of their own back in sort of the late 70s, early 80s. If you remember, those of you watching back then, if you remember that storyline where they thought that Roman was the Salem slasher and he was jailed, and then Alice and Beau sort of teamed up to get him out of jail, and she baked some donuts that were laced with something so the guards would get sick so that Beau could come in and sort of break Roman out of jail because they knew he was innocent. There was also her teaming up with Beau here during the infamous Hope and Larry Welch wedding, where they disguised someone else as the bride so Hope could ride off in that iconic scene of Hope and Beau riding off into the sunset down the highway. Alice Horton was very much instrumental in that. So I just want to highlight this extra special relationship that Alice had with Beau over the years. She called him Beau. Of course, he affectionately called her Mrs. H. And yeah. So yeah, that was kind of Alice, a little bit of Alice Horton throughout the years. Of course, like I said, she remained the moral center, no matter how crazy or dysfunctional her kids got or her grandkids got. She very much was a constant in their life and a constant for the Horton family. I think since her passing over the years, they've slowly moved Julie into that center. I'd like to see them get back to highlighting the Horton family a little bit more. Of course, we have Julie, we have Doug, who's no longer there. I'd like, bring back Lucas. We've gone back and forth with Hope and Beau, sort of coming back and spending some time. And Jennifer and Jack are sort of in and out. But yeah, I'm very much into sort of building up the Horton family again. So fingers crossed, we have some new writers who are very much interested in nostalgia and bringing characters back and focusing on family. So yeah, love to see that. So yeah, thanks. That was this week's edition of Those Were Days Extended, and I will see you guys next week. Thanks. Bye. Take care. Those were the